Historically, this idea is not new. Connectivity long before modern means of communication emerged. Through millennia, people of Eurasia moved across. Whether it was the merchants, whether it was the Buddhist monks, whether it was the Islamic preachers, what you had was the region found people moving across, both on the land and on sea, connecting very different parts of Asia through trade networks, through spiritual networks, through pilgrimages, that the region has always been integrated. But it's really the nature of that integration that has actually dramatically transformed over the last 300 to 400 years. We're all familiar with the famous Silk Road that actually connected eastern seaboard of China with the Mediterranean. But it's really with the advent of capitalism that you see the dramatic transformation of connectivity that takes place. That it was the age of Vasco da Gama when we say that the Europeans' quest for new colonial territories, the European quest to connect the resources to industrial production centers and the export of that goods back to the markets around the world. So it was a logic of global capitalism and the age of colonialism that actually began to integrate different parts of Eurasia on a scale that was unprecedented. And that's why we call that age the first age of globalization, which saw extraordinary linkages that emerged through different parts of Asia, all but led by the European colonial powers. So what we saw in this period was after centuries of inward orientation of the feudal years of China and India, that you see India and China becoming part of a global network, although limited parts of it. Nevertheless, you saw India and China become part of the global system. But after independence, after decolonization, and after the revolution in China, you saw both China and India actually turn inwards. But that period, I think, came to an end in China in 1978, when Deng Xiaoping returned to power, and in India in 1991, that once now China and India began to reconnect to the world. I think much of what we've seen in the last 25 years is the unfolding of that expansive reconnection of the Asia to the two different parts of the world. We generally assume geography is immutable, unchanging. The geography is a natural feature that does not change. But I believe geography is only, that immutable nature of geography is only one part of it. Geography is not just physical, but how that physical geography behaves, it depends a lot on the nature of the politics and economics of the geography. In India that is outward oriented, connected to the world under the British Raj, was the center of the global economic system in the Indian Ocean. But in India that turned inwards and became self-reliant socialist India for 40 years under the Nehruvian era, did not matter to the world because it consciously dissociated or disconnected itself from the rest of the world. So therefore, geography is not just a physical thing, that the nature of the economic and political orientation fundamentally alters the scope and nature of the physical space that we talk about it. Just look back at the Indian experience in the 19th century. The British Empire in India created new cities: Bombay, Madras, Calcutta, Hong Kong, Singapore. None of this would exist but for the fact that the East India Company, using the resources of India, would connect these different parts through trading networks. That it was a part of that policy of bringing capitalism, bringing modernization, that you saw the spread of the creation of these new cities, the new trading routes, and the whole systems associated with it. So what we see in that sense, what the Chinese are doing today is really one of where the Chinese capital is expanding outwards. Much of we see what happening is very much built into the system, and I think that is the reality that we have to deal with, because the Chinese need connectivity. Similarly, Indians talk about connectivity. Indians also need connectivity. If you're sitting in Western China, you've got to connect South Asia coming to the sea. Ports of South Asia were always going to be close to Western China than the Eastern Seaboard, which is so far away, while you see the Western China there sitting right on top of South Asia, and that you needed that connection So it was once the Chinese created the capabilities, created the markets, developed the region in the West, it was a matter of time they had to bring it down into South Asia. So we used to accuse the Russians of this dream for warm water ports, but in some ways you can say the same thing about the Chinese, which is that the Chinese need to connect to the waters of Bay of Bengal, the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. So what you're talking then is the expansion of the Chinese capitalism to connect to the inner spaces that exist. And in the process, what you're doing is really to shrink, to reconnect this part of the world in a dramatic form. So given that, what do we do? Where does India stand? What does India do? India, of course, at this point, neither supports the BCIM, neither supports the Silk Road Initiative, nor opposes it. Or it says, look, some parts we don't like a curate seg, some parts we're happy to discuss with the Chinese. India, for example, has concerns about sovereignty. So therefore, if the Chinese corridor through Pakistan comes through Kashmir, which is claimed by India, India says, look, we're not going to support any initiative that is built on territory that is claimed by India. But India has been willing to discuss the other corridor that comes from Myanmar, Bangladesh, and into India, where there are no sovereignty disputes. India is quite happy to talk to the Chinese and see whether we can work together to develop a system where we can work together with them. It is not an abstract philosophical question, are you for it or against it, that it depends on the circumstance. So therefore, but that is one part of it. The second part of it, of course, clearly for many in India, the Chinese expansion of the Chinese economic influence also means, would it also mean increase in the political influence? Okay, Chinese build a port here, Sri Lanka. It's so close to India. And suddenly, last year, we have the Chinese nuclear submarines show up here, just in Colombo port, where the Chinese actually have a big contract. The Gwadar port here in Pakistan, of course, some people fear there's going to be a military base. After all, remember the East India Company, they came to trade with India, and it's only later they became colonial powers. Not that you can expand that logic today, but the fact that many in India fear that this is the beginning of a dramatic Chinese expansion of Chinese military power, Chinese strategic power in the Indian Ocean, and that is something we need to be worried about. But the problem is, this is not going to solve the central question for India. How does India deal with the dramatic expansion of the Chinese economic power and its radiation in all directions towards India? What does it do? One, it's quite clear that if China is the second largest economy, you're not going to merely say, we're not going to deal with the second largest economy. Therefore, if India has trade with China, India is inviting Chinese investments, so are our neighbors. So in some senses, again, the logic of economic cooperation with China applies to everyone, and therefore there is going to be an expansion of economic cooperation between China and our neighbors. So given these conditions, what does India do? How does India work? This is where I think that a partnership with Japan provides a fundamentally different approach to the question of connectivity in Asia. Long before Asian Infrastructure Bank, it was Japan and the ADB that provided significant capital and ideas in terms of building regional integration. Regional connectivity were largely Japanese ideas. One speech on PQI, $110 billion have actually been put down by Abe-san, that actually there is a proposal to do various things. But I think it has not gathered the kind of traction, at least in the public discourse, of the kind that OBOR has got. And I think, but if these ideas are pursued in the coming years, Japan can be and will be an important player in the construction of new connectivity corridors in this part of the world. Long before OBOR became popular, some of my Chinese friends told me, look, where have we got this idea? We say, look, we saw the Japanese do the Mumbai-Delhi corridor. That's within India. It's one of the greatest, biggest investments of building a high-speed, not high-speed, a freight corridor of moving freight on modern lines and of creating industrial towns all along. This idea, 2005. The Japanese have also talked, I think, along with the Indians, for example. We now talk about doing a corridor here. I said the Mumbai-Delhi corridor is being built here. Then the Japanese are also doing here Chennai-Bangalore corridor, which is going to be a very major industrial town. And if things go well, they also want to do a multimodal corridor across here from Vietnam all the way through Bangkok, through to connect to Eastern Indian seaboard, that there are possibilities of actually, there is a port here being developed called Dave, which can then actually, you create connections between Southeast Asia and South Asia through these various initiatives. So in some senses today, the Japanese are beginning to integrate South Asia and the Bay of Bengal into their larger thinking, which previously it was very narrowly focused on Southeast Asia. But today, the idea that, look, the Japanese have a role beyond the Malacca, beyond this world of East Asian world, in this part, has become a reality with the kind of investment that the Japanese are talking about and the kind of political initiatives that Japan is taking. So what you're seeing then is India's interest of internal connectivity, India's interest in trans-border connectivity, India's interest in finding an alternative to Chinese proposals, actually is today the Japanese PQI provides that alternative basis. The question then is not just about saying, I'm redoing the Silk Road, what are the terms? So a more active Japanese policy would actually provide alternative ideas for the Asia. I think Japanese have good ideas, but what they don't have is the kind of a political packaging or the political promotion of it. But I believe that, at least in some parts, if India and Japan work together in this part of the world, in the Bay of Bengal, in South Asia, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, and even in Africa, then you can think of a partnership between India and Japan to be able to do regional connectivity projects. But this does not have to be seen as a competition with China or against China, but it gives options for every country in the region. That I think today India and Japan have a historic opportunity, a rare moment where, for the first time since the end of the war, that their interests today are actually in convergence. The need for rapid development of India and its neighboring regions, the need for India to restore its connectivity to its neighboring countries, the need for India to rebuild the Indian Ocean, modernize its infrastructure, coincides with the Japanese interest today of expanding their investments, of supporting a framework which would do precisely that. For the first time then, we are talking about India and Japan pooling their resources of working together to transform the development of infrastructure in this large part of the world. And I think that provides a unique basis for larger political and institutional cooperation between India and Japan. And that is the great opportunity. And I think there was a time when Buddhism came from all the way from India through China to Japan. And while we have had other contacts since then, today our two prime ministers talk about the spiritual contact as well. I don't know how much infrastructure we need for that, but the fact is, at least there is a political recognition that we need to bring the two countries together in multiple ways. And I think a strong infrastructure initiative that an Indian support to the PQI and Japanese support to modernization of the South Asian infrastructure would produce outcomes that are going to be beneficial for all in this region. So I think I'll stop here.